She wasn't his. That was the version of events Krale had been running in his head for 3 years. Every morning, when Calla walked into his corner office above the lake, set a black coffee exactly 2 inches from his left hand, and started quietly dismantling the financial wreckage he'd built in the hours she'd been gone. She was his bookkeeper. That was the accurate word. Not assistant, not secretary. She had corrected him on this in the 2nd week without blinking, the way someone reads a weather forecast. "I track the money, Mr. Krale. All of it. That makes me a liability to you, not a convenience." Already moving on before he could respond. Calla Rhen was 29. She had grown up in a 2-room flat above a coin laundry in Scarborough and had put herself through Ryerson's accounting program on a string of part-time jobs she never talked about. She had walked into the Meridian Group's legitimate holding company 6 months before Krale quietly bought it out. He had kept 3 employees from the original firm. She was the only one who'd lasted past the 1st year. She never asked what the money was for. She tracked it, structured it, buried it, cleaned it, and she did it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made peace long ago with the fact that the world was not a particularly moral place, and you survived it by being necessary. Krale had built his organization across the Eastern Corridor from Montreal to Windsor. Unions, ports, a pharmaceutical distribution network operating under 3 layers of shell companies, and a very specific reputation for making problems disappear with minimal collateral waste. He was 41, had a scar that ran from his left ear to the edge of his jaw, and hadn't slept more than 5 consecutive hours in the better part of a decade. He ran his empire on cold calculation and the conviction that sentiment was a luxury that got people killed. He told himself his interest in Calla was pragmatism. She was the best he'd ever seen with a ledger. She could find a discrepancy across 400 pages of transaction data the way other people find a typo. Instinctively, without effort, her pen moving to the right line before she'd consciously registered something was wrong. He needed her because she was exceptional. That was the lie. It was a Tuesday in February when she said she was leaving at 5. Not a question, not a request. She set the revised shipping manifests on his desk, aligned them with the edge of the blotter, and said, "The quarterly review is prepped. Everything's tabbed. I'm leaving at 5 today." Krale looked up from his phone. The words took a moment to land. "You leave at 5 when I leave at 5, he said. "My contracted hours end at 5, Calla said. She didn't look up from the folder she was closing. "I stay late because the job usually requires it. Tonight it doesn't. I have the quarterly review at 7. With Dubec." She set the folder on the corner of his desk. "The numbers are clean. I've highlighted anything he might try to dispute in yellow. If he brings up the November fuel allocations, tell him to check tab 6. She picked up her bag, a worn brown leather tote she'd clearly owned for years, one handle starting to fray where it met the brass ring. "It's all there. Where are you going?" He heard the edge in his own voice and tried to flatten it before the last syllable was out. He didn't quite manage it. Calla looked at him. She had grey eyes, the colour of Lake Ontario in November, and they had a particular quality of seeing through things most people spent energy hiding. She looked at him now with that gaze and said, "Somewhere that isn't here, Mr. Krale." She left. The heavy door closed behind her with a precise, weighted click that echoed in the room long after she was gone. Krale stood at the window and watched the February dark settle over the lake. The CN Tower blinked slow red against the grey sky. He told himself the tightness in his chest was irritation, a scheduling inconvenience. He went to the meeting at 7. He sat across from Dubec, who was 63 and sweating, and spent 90 minutes citing figures from a yellow-tabbed folder without once needing to ask for clarification. He ate the man alive, using nothing but numbers Calla had spent a Wednesday preparing. When he got back at 9, the bullpen was dark. Her desk was closed down. Everything aligned with the surface edges the way she always left it. He stood there in the empty room for a moment, not sure what he was looking for. He opened the top drawer of her desk. He wasn't proud of it. There was a spare charger, a box of peppermints, a small black notebook she used for task tracking. He opened the notebook. Work notes, mostly. Shorthand he'd learned to decode over 3 years. DG transfer, delay until Thurs, flag Q4 liability clause. He flipped toward the back. The handwriting changed. Less clipped, a grocery list, a reminder to call her landlord about the radiator. Then on the second-to-last page, Wednesday 7:30, Barrow dinner. Barrow was a restaurant on King Street West. Candlelit, exposed brick, a wine list that cost more than Calla's monthly rent. It was not a place you went for a work dinner. It was a place you went when you wanted someone to look at you across a table and decide you were worth staying for. Krale closed the notebook. He put it back in the drawer. He closed the drawer. He stood with his hands flat on her desk for a long moment. Then he went downstairs and got in the car. Yuri didn't ask. Yuri had been driving for Krale for 11 years and had learned with great precision the exact volume of silence the job required. When Krale said, "King West, Barrow, stay at the curb," Yuri nodded and drove. The city was wet. It had been sleeting since afternoon, the kind that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, glazing the sidewalks in a thin, treacherous film. Krale stood on the pavement outside the restaurant with his collar up and looked through the front window. He found her in 40 seconds. She was in a booth near the back wall, and she was not the Calla he knew. The Calla he knew wore structured blazers and kept her dark hair pinned back in a way that suggested she had no time for anything non-functional. The woman sitting in the booth had let her hair down. It fell past her shoulders, catching the candlelight, and she was wearing a dark green dress, not flashy, not expensive, but the kind of thing that made her look like she'd chosen it for herself and no one else. She was laughing. Not the small, controlled acknowledgement of amusement she gave when his associates said something they thought was funny. A real laugh, head tilted back, one hand pressed briefly to the table to anchor herself. It reached her eyes and changed the whole shape of her face. Krale looked at the man across from her. He was maybe 32, sandy hair slightly thin at the temples, a navy blazer over a plain white shirt. He had the look of someone who worried about reasonable things, car maintenance, mortgage renewal, whether he was eating enough vegetables. He looked like a man who had never once done anything that would require a forensic accountant to make it disappear. He looked safe. He reached across the table and placed his hand over Calla's. The movement was easy, casual, the gesture of a man who had already decided he liked her and wasn't afraid to show it. Krale's hands, deep in his coat pockets, had curled into fists so tight he could feel the seam of the lining. He told himself it was surveillance. He was responsible for the people who worked for him. If Calla was seeing someone, he had a right to know whether that someone was a liability. Professional diligence. He was lying to himself and he knew it. The man said something. Calla laughed again, and then she looked toward the window. Not at him, not quite, but in the direction of the glass, the way you do when something in your peripheral vision shifts. Her expression changed for just a moment. Something uncertain moved across it. She looked away. Krale stepped back from the window and walked back to the car. The interior was warm and dry and it felt like a different planet. "Back to the office," he said. He pulled out his encrypted phone before they'd cleared the block. He already knew the man's name. He'd had it texted to him within 3 minutes of arriving at the restaurant. Hugh Dunning, 31, junior compliance analyst at a mid-size investment firm on Bay Street. Clean record, decent credit score, a Liberty Village apartment he shared with a roommate. He volunteered at a kids' hockey program on Saturday mornings. No debts that couldn't be explained, no habits that could be leveraged, no edges to catch and pull. A person who had never once, in his entire adult life, earned an enemy. Krale dialed a number anyway. There were people who owed him. There were always people who owed him. That was how the machine ran. On debt, obligation, and the particular arithmetic of what people would do to protect the things they cared about. He had never used those debts for something like this before. He used them now. Calla came in at 8:50 the next morning in her grey blazer with her hair pinned back, carrying 2 coffees. She set one on his desk at the usual distance and said, "The February statements from the Lakeshore accounts are ready. You'll want to look at the column 3 variance before you sign off." "Fine," Krale said, eyes on his screen. "How was dinner?" The pause was very small, a fraction of a second. If he hadn't spent 3 years learning the precise rhythm of her, he would have missed it entirely. "Fine," she said. "Thank you for asking." "Interesting place, Barrow." "It has a good menu." She opened her laptop. "The Lakeshore variance isn't an error. It's a timing issue with the Mississauga receivable. I've drafted a note in case it comes up with the auditors." He watched her work. She was already somewhere else, already inside the numbers, her expression settling into the focused quiet that he had seen every single day for 3 years and still hadn't managed to take for granted. He thought, she'll never find it. He was wrong. It took her 9 days. He was in the middle of a call with a contact in Halifax when Calla appeared in the doorway of the inner office. She didn't knock, she never knocked, but she usually paused for a beat before entering. She didn't pause. He held up a finger. 48 hours, he said into the phone. "Move the cargo and don't call this number again until it's done." He hung up. Calla was standing at his desk. She was holding a single sheet of paper. She set it down in the center of his blotter with a careful, deliberate movement and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. He looked at the paper. A billing statement from his legal team, the ones he used for legitimate restructuring work, whose invoices Calla processed as part of her scope. He had been careful. He had buried the relevant instruction under a corporate amendment review, billed to the Lakeshore Trust, one of the outer shells, one she theoretically accessed only for the surface accounts. Theoretically. The line she had highlighted in neon yellow, the same yellow she used when she thought he was being obtuse about his own profit margins, read, "Dunning Asset Review and Compliance Block Facilitation, 4.5 Herr S." The billing date was the Thursday after her dinner at Barrow. Krale kept his face exactly where it was. He was very good at this. "Is there an error in the invoice?" he said. "No." Her voice was the same flat professional register it always was, except it wasn't. There was something underneath it, something compressed and cold, like a fault line before it shifts. No error. She didn't sit. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides. "Hugh Dunning," she said. Krale didn't answer. "He called me 8 days ago," Calla continued. "He said his compliance certification had been flagged for review. He didn't know who to call. I told him it was probably administrative." A pause. "He hasn't called since, because he no longer has a position at his firm. He also doesn't have his apartment. His building was purchased last week by a numbered company that immediately triggered a renovation clause in all existing leases." Her eyes moved from the paper to his face. "I've been managing the books for this organization for 3 years. I know how the shells connect. I know what a Lakeshore Trust instruction means, and I know that it went out the morning after I had dinner." The room was very quiet. "He was an exposure risk," Krale said. "You spend your evenings with a Bay Street compliance analyst, Calla. Someone who asks the right questions for a living. That's a liability. He doesn't know what I do. I'm an accountant for a holding company. That's all he knew." "That's enough. You ruined a man's life." There was something in her voice now that was not controlled. Not loud, Calla was never loud, but real. Something that had been building pressure for a long time. "He did nothing wrong. He took me to dinner and he was kind to me. And you dismantled his entire livelihood in 72 hours. Because he sat across a table from me and I laughed at something he said." Krale stood up. He came around the desk, slowly. She didn't step back. Calla Rhen, who had grown up with nothing and spent her adult life making herself indispensable to people who frightened other people, looked up at him and did not move an inch. "You don't own me," she said. "I work for you. I'm very good at it. But you do not get to make decisions about who I spend my evenings with. Not now. Not ever." "You're inside my organization," Krale said. That makes you my responsibility." "No." She held his gaze without flinching. "I'm your bookkeeper. I track your money. I don't belong to your organization. I belong to myself." She picked up her tote from the visitor chair. "I quit." The word landed like a stone in still water. "I won't accept it." "It isn't yours to accept." She slung the bag over her shoulder. "I'll send transition documentation by end of week. Everything is structured. It won't be hard to hand over." She walked to the door. Every instinct Krale had, and he had many, sharpened over 20 years, told him to cross the room, to get between her and the door, to make her stay the way he made everything stay, through sheer force of will and the particular gravity of a man who had never once accepted an outcome he hadn't chosen. He didn't move. He watched her hand close around the doorframe. "Calla." She stopped. "Make it whole," he said. He said it the way he said everything that cost him something. Quickly, without ornament, as if attaching too many words would make it somehow harder to get through. "Dunning, his job, his apartment, all of it. I'll make the calls today." A pause. "It won't undo it, but I'll make it whole." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Okay," she said. And then she walked out. She lasted 3 weeks in a normal life. She had a reference from the holding company, the legitimate one, the one that existed on paper, and she found a position at a logistics firm in Etobicoke within 8 days. Reasonable salary, reasonable commute, pleasant colleagues. She sat in her first team meeting and listened to a project manager talk about synergies for 20 minutes. She went home that night and sat on her couch and looked at the wall. She thought about Krale's ledgers, about the particular architecture of the money, the way everything connected to everything else in patterns that were almost elegant, if you didn't think too hard about what it was for. She thought about the fact that she had spent 3 years being the most important person in a room full of dangerous men and had never once been afraid. Because she'd understood that in any room, the person who knows where the money goes is the one who actually holds the door. She called Hugh on the 4th day. He was fine. Better than fine, actually. He'd received a job offer from a significantly better firm, the kind that didn't come through normal channels. He sounded bewildered by his own good fortune. She said she was glad. She meant it. She sat with the fact that Krale had done it. He had said he would make it whole, and he had made it whole. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what to do with it. On the 18th day of her normal life, someone knocked on her apartment door at 11 at night. Yuri, standing in the hallway in his heavy coat, hat in his hands, the look of a man who had driven a long way on a bad night. She opened the door. "He told me not to come," Yuri said immediately. "He specifically said, if I involved you, I wouldn't have a job. Possibly other things." He swallowed. "But there's no one else who can do anything with him, Ms. Wren." The safe house was in the East End, above a shuttered print shop on Danforth. The stairwell smelled like old paper and cold concrete and something sharper underneath, copper and antiseptic. Calla had stopped at a pharmacy on the way. She pushed the door open without knocking. Krale was on a cot against the far wall. He was in a white undershirt, which was no longer entirely white. The wound was on his left side, below his ribs. Not critical, Yuri had said in the car, but he'd refused a doctor, refused everything, and had been sitting in the dark bleeding for the better part of 4 hours. He opened his eyes when the door moved. For a moment, just a moment, the thing that crossed his face was nothing like the controlled, calculated expression she knew. It was something unguarded and raw, the face of a man who had been waiting for something he had stopped letting himself expect. Then it closed up. "Yuri," he said, without looking away from her, "we're going to have a conversation about this." "I'm prepared for that," Yuri said from the doorway. He pulled the door shut. Calla crossed the room. She set the pharmacy bag down, snapped on gloves, and opened the kit. She looked at the wound. Deep, but the angle had missed anything vital. Lucky. Reckless. "You need stitches." "It'll close." "It's been 4 hours. It isn't closing." She poured antiseptic onto gauze. "This is going to hurt." She pressed the soaked gauze directly into the wound without further warning. His entire body went rigid, every cord of muscle in his neck standing out sharp, jaw locked, a low sound forcing its way through his teeth. His hand shot out and found her forearm. Not to stop her, just to hold on to something. His grip was very tight. She held the pressure steady. "You have an informant inside the organization," she said. She'd been running it in her head since Yuri told her what happened. The timing on the warehouse coordination. Someone told them where you'd be. A pause, strained. "Yes. You knew before tonight. I suspected. And you didn't move fast enough." He opened his eyes and looked at her directly, and in the low light of the single overhead bulb, with the pain stripped away and the control stripped away, he looked like what he actually was. A man who had spent 20 years being exactly as hard as the world required and was now running, very quietly, out of room. "I was distracted," he said. She applied the closure strips with steady hands. She worked in silence. Then she said, "What were you going to do?" "If I'd never found the invoice. If I'd never figured it out, what was the plan? You just removed him and waited for me to stop wondering why he stopped calling." "I was going to wait," Krale said. His voice was rough with controlled pain. "Until you stopped thinking about him. Until I was the only thing left in the room." "That's a terrible plan." "It was a very bad plan," he agreed. "I'm aware." She cut a length of bandage tape and worked it flat against his skin. "I don't need you to protect me from people who want to take me to dinner," she said. "I've been navigating this world since I was 16. I've sat across from men twice your size and talked them down from decisions that would have gotten people killed. I have never once needed someone to remove a threat on my behalf." "I know that." Then what was it for? He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't stand it," he said finally. He said it the way he delivered a balance sheet. Flatly, without decoration, as if attaching too many words to it would make it harder to get through. "That's the whole truth. I stood outside that window in the cold and I watched a man I had never met put his hand over yours, and I could not stand it." He paused. "I have run this organization for 15 years. I have managed situations that most people don't survive. I have never once lost control of a room." Another pause. "I lost control of this one the moment you walked through my door and told me you were a liability, not a convenience." Calla looked at him for a long time. She thought about the invoice with the neon yellow highlight. She thought about Hugh, who was now apparently doing better than he had been before all of this. She thought about 3 weeks in a reasonable office with reasonable people, and the way the silence in the evenings had felt like something was missing. Not someone, but something. A particular quality of purpose, of stakes. She thought about the fact that she had bought the first aid kit without hesitating. She had not stopped to consider whether to come. She had just put on her coat. "You could have told me," she said. Telling you would have meant admitting it. And you didn't want to admit it. "Men in my position don't admit things like that," he said, "not without understanding what they're handing over." He looked at her, "Not without knowing whether the other person is going to use it." "And now you know I will." "Yes," he said, "I do." She reached out. She put her hand flat against the side of his face. Not gently, not softly, just steadily. The way you'd check whether something is real. He closed his eyes. "You don't own me," she said. "Nobody does. That's not something I'm negotiating." "I know." "But..." She kept her hand where it was. She watched the line of his jaw, the scar, the particular exhaustion of a man who had been managing everything except the one thing that actually mattered to him. "I am the best bookkeeper you are ever going to find. I know where every dollar goes and exactly what it's attached to. And I have been managing this organization's accounts for 3 years, which means I know where every pressure point is and how to apply it." She let her thumb rest against his jaw for a moment. "So if you ever take action against someone in my personal life again, without my knowledge, without my consent, I will account for it, every single line item, down to the last decimal. Are we clear?" A pause. We're clear, Krale said. She lowered her hand, she stood up, she looked at him, sitting on the cot in the dim light with his new bandage and his careful, wrecked face. You need water and you need to sleep, she said. I'll stay until Yuri gets back. She went to find a cup. Behind her, she heard the particular quality of silence that meant he was watching her go and not looking away. She had walked into his building 3 years ago because she needed work that paid enough to matter. She had stayed because she was exceptional at what she did, and the money was excellent, and she had told herself, very firmly and very often, that none of the rest of it counted. She would need to renegotiate the contract. She was absolutely going to make him give her a raise, 20% at minimum, and she already knew he would agree before she finished the sentence. Some things, she understood now, you didn't walk away from because they were safe or clean or easy. You stayed because you were the only person who knew the full shape of the machine. You stayed because without you, the numbers didn't add up. And because the man on the other side of the desk had finally, in a cold room above a print shop on Danforth, told you the truth. He had been counting her as a fixed asset all along. She had simply decided she was going to own the balance sheet. When a man who controls half a city loses control over a woman with a ledger, he doesn't send flowers. He quietly dismantles everything in her way and calls it protection until she finds the receipt. The real question isn't whether Calla forgave him. It's whether you think she ever needed saving in the first place. Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this one got under your skin, subscribe. There's more where this came from.